We actually haven't had case debate since our first round.
Oh, really?
Crazy.
Yeah.
We had 2 AFKs in a row.
Yeah. That's rough.
No, I need a flow. Yeah, that'd be smart.
Any preferences that anybody like wants to share before we start? Okay.
Oh, on my end, verbal PO answer.
Oh yeah.
Say it again?
Do you guys
Verbal
want
POIs.
introductions, names really quickly?
Yeah.
Alright, go.
Okay. My name is Trevor Jacobin. I'll be first and third speaker on the government side for Hillbrook.
My name is Trayon Jane, and I'll be the second speaker on the government.
I'm Yonatan Bartura. I'll be first and third on the gov. On the off.
Ariel Segura, the second, he can pronounce verbal POIs.
Roadmap. Are you guys okay if I sit while I speak? Great. Roadmap's going to be a good amount of framework, either 3 or 4 contentions.
Give me just 1 second. I'm so sorry, guys.
Take your time. Ready. I'm just going to grab my water.
Please. Trevor's first and third on this side, and then who's first and third on my off?
Yonatan Bartura.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Everybody ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll begin. 3, 2, 1. Proud to affirm that rising oil prices do more harm than good. Definitions. Oil is probably like equivalent to petroleum, crude oil, things like that. Rising means basically either it's going up. Rising oil prices basically means it's going up, which means the alternative to rising prices is decreasing prices or stable prices. This will be key in the round. We are advocating that rising prices are bad, and we could say that stable prices are good, and that would be a vote for the affirmative. Okay, great. We also want to say that like rising also includes like big oil shocks, of course. Inherently, you're gonna look at that. Okay, on the framework, we think you're probably going to be looking at like impacts on marginalized individuals first when you're evaluating your impacts in the round, just because like people that are like that are suppressed the most are the ones that
POC pause
prioritized.
time.
Yes.
Sorry, this was like a little bit ago, but for when you say stable is also okay. By stable, do you mean like the same number, or it increases with inflation and that's considered stable?
With inflation,
Like stable is probably just like in accordance with global economy, like nothing. It's in comparison to what like world economy is. If nothing is like actually rising, if everything's correlatively rising,
Yeah, so basically with inflation.
kind of.
Okay.
Okay. It's tricky. Okay, my time will resume in 3, 2, 1. So on the framework, you're looking at impacts on people that are like at most risk of harm, because we should help feed the poor before we give a cookie to the rich. Like this is just how you're going to be looking at in this round. You're laying those impacts that are about structural violence over everything else. We define this round as probably a fact round, but you're probably looking at like whichever side like proves like more harm or more good. So it's probably more like of a net benefits weighing that you're going to be looking at this round in.
Sorry, just on framework, you said, well, I understood the framework. I don't know if it was said in regards to minority groups being held over richer individuals.
Like people that are structurally oppressed that are like at further risk are probably going to be layered over.
And is that your framework?
That's one point on the framework. Then I'm still going.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. I'm going to zoom 3,
Whatever.
2, 1. Also, just like some background points I want to give is that, like, for example, in oil profits, 50% of oil profits go to the top 1%, and only 1% goes to like the bottom 50%. So that's just an example of where like structural income goes and benefits the top like rich people. Okay, great. So the second point on the framework is that oil is inevitable. There's 3 points on this. The first one is like an investor obligation in a capitalist world in which investors will always basically use oil because it's cheaper regardless of the cost, which means that they're always going to be thinking of the capitalist mindset of making more money because they have an obligation to shareholders to make them the most money possible, which means that oil is always going to be the thing that companies pick. So you like switching to other alternatives just won't happen. The second point here is infrastructure. Like all infrastructure worldwide is basically built to.
POI?
Yes.
Do we not care about the rising use in green energy?
I'll get onto this later. B is that infrastructure supports like all worldwide infrastructure is really like actually is built towards oil. Like there isn't a capacity to switch, especially in developing countries that are super oil reliant and have no alternative. C is that the scroll is actually sometimes trending away from green energy. We see, for example, the U.S. is literally banning renewable energy practices in favor of more oil and natural gas based practices. We see that like there's actually like global trending towards oil, especially as oil is actually like even environmentally a better alternative to coal, which is like another main energy source. So oil is always better than coal as well. Give that. The first contention is on fertilizer. The uniquest one is that oil and crude oil is like basically a fundamental component of what's used for fertilizer that kills like insects and bugs and stuff that's harmful to crops. Uniqueness too is that basically like literally all the different farms in the world, like whatever like animal feed, whatever vegetables, everything that's grown uses fertilizer that uses crude oil. So basically all food in the world is dependent on fertilizer that's dependent on oil. Uniqueness 3, let's give some examples. For example, that's very repetitive. For example, in the Iran war, we see that there's probably going to be like over like there's like a huge, like right now we see oil prices that are rising like dramatically. We see there's going to be like a huge huge increase in food prices as well, like 3%, 5%, 10%, how much ever we want to see it. They're just increasing dramatically. Uniqueness 4 is that there's 2.3 billion people worldwide who are basically like in severe or moderate food insecurity, so basically at risk of losing all their food, and are super susceptible to like food price increases. Uniqueness 5 is that a projection is that like from this oil crisis and increase in rise prices, it's projected that 45 million people in Sudan and Gaza are going to lose access to food and probably starve because the price of the food that's being produced is going up way too much because oil is no longer able to supply it because it's so expensive for these companies that are making fertilizer to buy, which means they can't make as much fertilizer, which means that fertilizer also becomes more expensive. It's more expensive for farmers to buy it, and it's more expensive for them to grow crops. They can't grow as many crops, which means that people don't get as much food because there's not as much crop available, or it's more expensive and they can't afford it. So we see the link is that like when you have rising oil prices, you have worldwide detriment to people's access to food, which is also a prerequisite to anything else in life. If you don't eat, you can't like enjoy like whatever quality of life or benefit. You're literally dead. There's nothing coming back from that. Death is irreversible. Yeah, probably that's one.
I don't hear any warranting as to how crude oil is required for fertilizer. So can you explain on that?
It's literally
It's used as fuel.
okay. It's used as fuel in the Hillbrook process, which is like a structural component of how you make fertilizer. Okay. The second contention is going to just be on political shock. A uniqueness 1 is that large increases in oil prices do a ton of stuff. Like they basically like first of all, a 0.1% increase in oil in inflation is correlated to like a 5% increase in oil prices. It's the other way around. But what we see is that like when you have oil prices go up, inflation and spending and economic stuff goes really bad. And we see here and like uniqueness 2 that this causes enough like a displacement of the economy where internal shock to politics come and people start to get really mad. Let's look to India as a warrant here on the link of what happens when you have political shock. After the 1973 oil shock, where there was a rise in oil prices, we saw that there was literally a dictatorship installed to try to fight this price in oil because it was fundamentally all the infrastructure and everything within the economy. What happened is that over 100,000 people were literally imprisoned, like journalists in India, that were going against this dictatorship simply because this dictatorship was installed in response to the increase in oil prices, because oil is like, first of all, like it's a word that everybody goes, oh my god, oil, my prices are going up. But then also it's just like super key to everything else that runs within the world. Like, and I'll get into the next contention in a second. Okay, so the impact you see from rising prices is displacement of different like democratic systems. You see like a lot of like corruption comes from oil stuff, and you see that people are probably put into systems that are bad because people are responding to this shock that comes from the worldwide necessity that is oil. Uniqueness 3, the third contention is going to be on transportation. The A is that like it is on worldwide supply. We see that like 90% of global transit uses oil to power and fuel them. We also see that like we've seen already a 27% increase in the price of transportation for different goods and services throughout this, like with this current increase in rise in oil prices due to the Strait of Hormuz being restricted. What we see here in transportation, what you see again, you look to food but also to goods. All goods will increase basically correspondingly with the amount that global transportation is increasing by, which means that everybody on the verge, we already articulated everybody on the verge of collapse. Let's just like one more statistic here, I'm sorry, but 85% of the world is literally living on less than $30 per day, which means they can all, like a ton of the world is in extreme poverty and can barely afford the goods they want. Rising oil prices like are basically indicative of a brink in which people can't afford their goods, people start to starve, people can't lack basic necessities, access to water, food, because everything is so expensive in this day and age, and which like transportation goes up, it makes it even more expensive and harder to access, and basically like worldwide quality of life and life itself goes down as well. The second B on transportation is going to be on like personal transportation. You're going to look towards how, like, for example, in the US as a warrant, like the average person spends about $2,700 of gas, $2,700 on gas per year, and we also see that that's like basically like at least 6% of their median income, which means that a rise. And we also see that there's like 46 million Americans on the edge of food insecurity, and an increase in gas prices as well correlate to less money to spend on necessities for them to survive, which is a prerequisite to everything else. But my partner will expand later, but that's why he booked up. Thank you.
Quick question, if that's okay. That last one thing about the last thing you said, was that C4?
That was a.
Or is that under C3 transport?
That's C3.
Okay.
Judges, you okay with a quick off-time roadmap? Yeah. Okay. So quick off-time roadmap. I'm gonna go top of case, off case. We have 4 contentions, and then should I say it? No, I'll say it in the middle. Top of case, off case. We have 4 contentions, and then responding to gov case. With that, I'll start my 8-minute speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, we thought this was a value round, not a fact round. Does not matter. The reasoning they give is the same as what we would have said for values, so it doesn't matter. I don't hear like a very consistent framework as to how we're going to do the rounds. So I believe net benefits to all make sense. If there was one, or if even if there wasn't, their impacts are very similar to this, so I think we agree on this and we can move on. I have a couple of overviews that I think are pretty important before we begin this round. Firstly, the U.S. is currently bad at climate policy. This is just a true statement. We've pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. We have, as they said, made it harder to get renewable energy. And overall, the U.S. has been bad on this issue. This also means that they're influencing other nations to do the same. The U.S. has a big sphere of influence in Latin America, in Africa, and so a lot of what they do then gets reflected. We've seen a lot of nations, especially under the Trump administration, have been trying to appeal to them and say, hey, we're going to get rid of this renewable energy thing. Can you help support us and give us money, such and such? Therefore, it's also true that there's a lot of other nations that have also been impacted by this. We also believe that the Paris Climate Agreement has done a very poor job as well. They are all talk and no game. They have talked a lot about all these agreements they want to do. However, consistently they've pushed back these deadlines further, saying they're not going to reach their goals. They had plans for a specific number of carbon they want in the air in 2020, 2025, 2030, 2035. It keeps getting pushed back because they're not meeting their goals. All of that I think is pretty uncontested on both sides. With that, moving on to our first contention, which is about green energy. We do believe that climate change is real and something that will eventually kill us all within our lifetimes if we continue with the status quo. The amount of oil that we are currently using, which then emits carbon into the air, which adds to air pollution, is so bad that at this rate, there's many studies that have been shown that in the next 50 to 70 years, it could kill humanity. It is that big of a problem. We uniquely have some sort of solution to this. We're not arguing that we're going to solve climate change with this one thing. That's obviously not going to happen. What we do have is reducing it, and then it's going to actually lead to more change in the future, something that Gov doesn't have. They don't have any sort of system to stop against climate change, which again is going to be a terminal impact for every single person on Earth, as well as many, many animals. What we see is that when you increase oil and we increase the price of oil, what we then see is all the nations scrambling to get more renewable energy. I'm talking wind, I'm talking solar, and all these were very expensive things maybe when they were first created in the early 2000s. They have consistently become more cheap for people to use. For a good example, this is solar panels, which in 2010 it cost $1,000 per solar panel. Today it is under $100 per solar panel. It's becoming more and more accessible to many people around the world, meaning that an argument that a small nation is not going to be able to pay for these renewable energies is minimal at best, if not flat out wrong, and will continue to be flat out wrong as it becomes increasingly easier to buy these in the future. The impact for this contention is that when you have the rising oil prices, it provides an incentive for politicians who have not had a climate being their focus to then make green energy more available, spend more time on green energy, and overall make sure that green energy becomes the new norm, which will allow for air pollution to stop and slowing down our climate change. Yes?
Don't countries usually turn to coal after oil prices go up?
We believe that coal is also a thing that is like a dying method of using energy. I've heard very little examples of how coal is going to be like the next big thing, and that also doesn't help with climate. So when incentivized, politicians know this is climate in mind. They also know that it's honestly these days becoming increasingly easier to get renewable energy that will last much longer than coal does, because coal is a resource and renewable energy is well renewable. So have a better bang for their buck if they choose to pay for renewable energy rather than coal that the second they use it goes away. With that, moving on to our second contention about behavioral change. We talked about the politicians, let's talk about the everyday person. Let's imagine you're a person in America, and now there's the war in Iran, and all of a sudden your oil prices have gone up like $1 million, not it's an exaggeration, like an extra $5 per gallon. You're now gonna go, okay, this will pass, so let me just not use my car for a week. I'll either walk or take the bus or whatever, and then later on I'll go back to using my car. And sure, maybe the war can end, maybe they'll go back to using their car, but it puts in this idea that oil is not a necessity. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans have been able to transport themselves and use their lives properly without the need for oil. Oil has only been discovered as a method of using for energy in the past 100 to 200 years. This now means that oil, because it's a limited resource and will run out of it as it comes from dinosaur fossil, you're then going to end up in a world where people are more behaviorally ready to shift to a more pro-climate climate position. They become more comfortable with taking the bus or walking or getting themselves in a position where they don't need their car. No, sorry, I have a lot to get through. It is going to be a struggle, we agree, but the difference between the op and the gov here is while they have a short-term paradise for then climate change killing them all, what we have is some pain to then make sure people don't die. People are very ignorant. A lot of people don't know how big climate change can be of an issue, and so forcing them to start thinking about what their lives would look like without oil is going to be beneficial for they themselves in the future. So the impact is going to be net benefit for everybody who's affected by these oil prices and change their behaviors because they're preparing themselves for a world where climate change is going to become much more of an issue, and using renewable energy is going to be much more of the norm. Moving on to our third contention about rising EV, we believe that electric vehicles specifically is a very big point and should warrant its own contention because of the benefits that it has. Electric vehicles, because they use electricity rather than oil, are able to use other technologies that help make the car safer. There's things such as auto braking, such as lane switching, telling you there's another car coming in the lane, that other cars simply aren't able to do. If you have an oil car, oil can't tell you that the car is going to automatically brake as a car in front of you. Electricity can't. What you're seeing is that people, if they're incentivized to now buy an electric vehicle, even if they don't think climate change is real or don't think it's really that important, are now going to be going in much safer cars. So the unexpected other impact of this, aside from the fact that you're now not going to be using oil cars, which is also definitely a contention, is you're going to be making everybody's lives safer by forcing them to use cars that are, well, again, safer, overall being a net benefit to everyone. Lastly, our fourth contention is about oil-based nations. They spend a good chunk of their time talking about nations that don't have these big structures or supports that allow them to exist in a world without oil. But what you see is that a lot of oil-based nations are benefiting from rising prices. Because oil is still going to be bought and sold to some extent, small nations that rely on oil as their economy are now going to benefit. An example of this is Guyana, which ever since 2024, as oil prices started dramatically going up because of conflicts in Sudan and now Iran, have been getting a lot more money, able to better support their country. And then also go support their neighbors as well. Other neighbors that don't even have oil in their nations are able to be helped by Guyana because they used to be all small, poor nations together, and they help one another. Overall, the impact of this is that small nations are also benefited because they can benefit from having an oil increase that will still be money will go to them. With that, moving on to government case, their first contention is about fertilizer. They say that fertilizer is required for crude oil. However, agriculture has been a thing in our society for several hundreds of years, potentially even thousands, without needing to use oil. Again, oil is a very new thing, 100, 200 years old, meaning that there's many different ways to use agriculture in a way that doesn't use oil. There's many alternatives. They don't bring that up. I don't see why that cannot be used. They say that 2.3 billion people have food insecurity. Well, 8 billion people are going to die if we don't fix climate change. One issue is way more important than the other. Judge, I think you can see on a numbers game which one is what. They also give the examples of Gaza and Sudan and how their people are starving because of this, but there's absolutely no warning as to why oil is the issue. Sudan and Gaza have starved as the issue because Sudan has been in a civil war since 2023, and Gaza has been in their own conflict with Israel. You can call it a genocide, you can call it a conflict of sorts, but it is because of Israel, it is not because of oil. Second contention about economics, they talk about how oil shocks led to dictatorship in India. That dictatorship was mainly created because of their issue in Pakistan, again, not because of oil. They tend to conflate a lot of things with oil, and it's simply not the case. Their impact is the displacement of democracy, but I see no warranting outside of an example, so I cannot buy it. Their third point on transportation is that transport needs oil. However, you pay for the oil, which means that you still have money you can use that can go towards renewable energy. So overall, judges, on the points of rising green energy, behavioral change, rising EVs, and oil-based nations, I urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
So my speech order is going to be a little bit of framework and then go over the negation case and then the act case in order. Yeah. If everybody's ready, is everybody ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, my time starts now. Okay, on the framework, the negation basically drops our entire point about oil being inevitable. They drop most of our framework. They say that their weighing mechanism is net benefits for everybody. We agree that net benefits is the most important thing. We do want to stipulate though that we think that impacts on the most marginalized should weigh above impacts on everybody else because they're already at the greatest risk, and hurting them is more it's more important than just giving a little benefit to rich people. So basically the most important thing here is they give an entire framework about how US climate policy is really bad and about how renewable energy is being banned because of Trump and pressuring other nations so that we need to do something. We agree that this is really bad, but we don't think oil prices on their own are going to solve for this. In fact, we think this feeds into our framework point about how oil is inevitable, about how investors use oil because of capitalism, how cheap it is, and how developing countries use oil because they don't have easy alternatives, and how the status quo is trending away because of policy like the US policy. When they tell us that the U.S. is influencing other nations away from renewable energy towards oil, this is actually a point in favor of our framework on oil being inevitable and how this means that oil is actually going to be around no matter what, and that we can't really do anything just by having prices go up to destroy oil in general. So, with that entire framework out of the way, the negation case's first contention is on green energy and about how you can transition to green energy when there's price pressure from oil. First, we want to respond by saying that our first response to this is that oftentimes nations will actually turn to coal because coal is even cheaper than oil and renewable energy. So when one of these sources goes away, most likely nations that are dependent on sources like,
is coal cheaper in general or per pound of coal?
In general, it's cheaper to produce like energy, like it's cheaper to get coal for energy production than it is to get renewable energy installed, and especially in nations where there's already infrastructure for fossil fuel based production, but renewable production still needs to be built up. And that is the case in most of these countries that are using oil, because oil is actually like a transition from coal to oil. So they're going to go back to coal once they already have the infrastructure for where they can. Also, another response to this contention is that you need stable oil prices in order to transition. If you look at the warrant of Norway, which is a country which used to be super dependent on oil, but was able to transition to renewable energy only because they had stable oil prices and were able to have an economy which they could expand on by introducing renewable energy. The second contention on behavioral change, our first response is that this hasn't happened in the past when oil shocks have happened. Like it hasn't sparked a mass change. It hasn't sparked a mass exodus into public transit and walking and biking. The reason for this is because cities, especially in the United States, are built around cars. They say that oil is only 100 to 200 years old in terms of how humans use it, but the thing is most of the cities and roads that have been developed in the United States are since then. Like the Federal Highways Act in the 1950s is after oil was discovered, and it built the entire highway infrastructure in the United States around this idea of cars. The United States and many countries are not built for public transit use, which is why a short-term behavioral shock won't suddenly get people to switch. When people don't have a car, they'll actually realize how inconvenient it is not to have a car, and will continue using the car when this change that makes their car use drop goes away. When oil prices go up, they'll maybe temporarily stop using the car or be squeezed in terms of prices, but they will not long-term transition to stop using cars. On the third contention about electric vehicles, they say that electric vehicles are better, safer, cleaner. Sure, maybe electric vehicles contribute less to climate change in general, but Chinese EVs, for example, have been known to leak sulfur dioxide into coral reefs, which are themselves carbon sinks. So electric vehicles are not inherently better than other kinds of vehicles. You cannot say that you have solvency for climate change when electric vehicles themselves have contributed to climate change by damaging coral reefs, which are a major carbon.
POC, pause time.
Yeah.
Sorry, are you making the argument that electric vehicles are more harmful for climate change than gas?
In the short term, yes, they are, because the carbon that is released when coral reefs are destroyed is actually like greater than just the amount.
Sorry, I meant like in general, not like in short term. Like both short term and long term put together. Like I'm trying to understand the argument.
Well, right now we're talking about like the status quo and what would happen if there's a sudden oil shock. What would happen is maybe some electric vehicles would get sold, but like it would cause this to happen.
Sorry, I might have missed the other words for EV
Like
plus
keep
coal.
going back and forth.
No, this is
POC.
I mean I could call another POC if you want me to. This is just another clarifying question. Did you give warranty for coral reef EV lead to coral reef damage?
Well, it's basically batteries leaking sulfur dioxide as they degrade.
from Chinese EVs.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
All right. So basically, we're evaluating what would happen in the status quo when oil prices rise or go down. And in that case, it is actually net detrimental for people to adopt electric vehicles in the short term, because they will release these kinds of things into the ocean and cause coral reefs to release a bunch of carbon as they get damaged by sulfur dioxide. On the fourth contention about oil nations and how they benefit from rising prices, our response is to cross-apply what we said in our first framework point about how most of the profit from rising oil profits goes to the top 1% in any country, and how only 1% of those profits actually flow to the bottom 50%. This is really important because if you look at a lot of these oil-producing nations, especially in the Middle East, in countries like Iran and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, these are dictatorships where the oil companies are basically tightly controlled by a few central people, and most of the benefits from oil prices going up will go to those people. There will be barely any benefit to the overall population. You'll only be producing a lot of money for a few people at the top of these oil companies and countries, while the rest of the people are left to suffer and starve because of the prices that are going up and the food prices that are going up from our first contention of fertilizer. Now, on to the affirmative case. Our first response, the fertilizer link chain here is basically that oil is used in the Hillbrook process as fuel for fertilizer. Why this is important is because you can buy their entire link chain on green energy and all of those and still be left with fertilizer that has no alternative. You need oil to produce this fertilizer. This is really important because this fertilizer is essential for producing food, especially because agriculture needs this. So they respond by saying that agriculture has been around for a long time and has not needed oil. In the last 100 to 200 years, the population has shot up by a lot in the entire world because of cleaner sanitation and industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture is the only way to meet the amount of food production that's needed to satisfy 8 billion people's hunger. If you have 8 billion people, you basically need this large-scale agriculture which relies on synthetic fertilizer. You can't just rely on natural fertilizer to stimulate crop growth, which is needed both to feed animals and for vegetarian food if that's what somebody is eating. Like either way, you need fertilizer to grow the food in the first place. And because synthetic fertilizer requires oil, when oil prices go up, fertilizer prices go up. When fertilizer prices go up, food prices go up. Already the UN has said that the current crisis in Iran, which has had a 50% increase in oil prices, could lead to 45 million people starving due to rising food costs from fertilizer. They say that this,
So when oil, which is an infinite resource, eventually runs out, is your world just screwed in terms of fertilizer?
It's slowly you can adopt renewable energy, but what's important is we don't want sudden price increases because when oil prices are stable or low, it's a lot easier to transition to renewable energy in the long run than when prices are rising. Rising oil prices are bad because the short-term impacts they have on people far outweigh maybe the marginal impact you'll have on solving climate change by having higher oil prices. So also they say that the people starving in Gaza are because of Israel. There is starvation because of the war, but this is additional starvation. Those are people who are already unable to access food because their war is going on. So any access to food that gets removed from those people is basically devastating and causes much worse consequences in terms of starvation and hunger. So any rise in food prices especially has the potential to disrupt the little food that they can get in those areas. They also don't refute the second contention of political shock at all. They say that it was because of Pakistan that India imposed a dictatorship. That's not true. Indira Gandhi literally cited the reason of an oil shock affecting the entire economy to justify control over the economy and needing the government to stabilize everything. That just happened. That's factual. 100,000 people were imprisoned because of that. So this kind of political shock from economic fallout does happen. And on the third contention on transport, we don't really understand the opposite response. They say that you still have money for renewables and EVs, but that doesn't mean that people who are using gas cars right now can suddenly switch to buying an electric vehicle and use that instead. People will be squeezed by rising oil prices. And the massive networks of transportation for actual products are themselves not going to just suddenly switch over to renewable energies. People will still need to be buying those goods and getting those shipped to their houses, which necessitates those transportation networks actually working. And when prices go up that much, then, for example, UPS has raised their charges on shipping to 27%, which is a really major impact for people who are already struggling and need food and water to be shipped to their houses. So overall, the totality here is that you're looking at a marginal impact on green energy, maybe from a little bit of an oil price rise, versus actual impacts on 45 million people starving because of oil price rises from the Iran war and all these other problems of political shock and transport that affect way more people than you might benefit from a little bit of climate change solvency. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Top case. Then op. No, then got the op. Okay, anybody not ready?
Give me 1 moment.
Of course. Ready?
Go ahead.
Awesome. I'll begin my time in 3, 2, 1. The government team tells us all the issues with oil. They tell us that oil is causing a ton of harm to our society. But when they present all these problems, they provide not a singular piece of solvency. You uniquely find that on the opposition. Starting on the points that oil is apparently inevitable. We tell you a few things. One, they work this out by arguing that capitalism is the reason why oil is inevitable. They argue that it is a cheap resource which people access. A few things. First, if that was the case, then we would be using coal. Why are we not doing that? Because again, it's not that people don't see the harm in these things. Because again, people see the harm in using certain things. People understand that and people adapt to that. Few additional responses. First, we see that oil is a limited thing that exists within our society. You're not using the entire supply and then spawning new oil. That's physically impossible. Meaning that oil is not inevitable, not on fiat, on basic logic, gut check there. Second, we tell you that oil is probably like a newer resource that we see within our society, especially in terms of its usage. So when we go ahead and like argue that it's inevitable for the reason that they give, it's not that, it's just that it's newer. That's why. Lastly, I think simple response is also, we give a bunch of incentive as to why we do have the ability to shift away from that and why they are incentivized to shift away from that. I.e., if UPS is increasing prices, this means people will want to ship with them less, which is not good in the capitalist system. They do want to keep things cheap at a reasonable price, and we see that if oil is unstable, which we see very frequently within our world, that isn't being people aren't being benefited by the capitalist system. For that reason, drop the response. Moving on to the government case. Few things on the point that like we ought to consider the minority groups over the rich people. They argue. We tell you that like all people are affected by oil. We tell you that when we warrant out to climate change, we see very clearly that it doesn't matter what type of person you are, you're dying either way. So should we allow climate change to exist? So at minimum, when you're evaluating the impact of climate change, we argue that you probably shouldn't take into account, well, there is no way to take into account minority over rich. Moving on to first contention, they argue fertilizer. They tell us that we need this fertilizer that uses oil, and if not, we lead to worldwide detriment. We respond saying agriculture, we see agriculture as an innovating space. We see that it isn't the only option, natural fertilizer being one of them. We see that climate change outweighs either way, and we see that there's worldwide, and that's the issues that they present about food insecurity are actually because of conflict, not because of oil. The responses that we receive are apparently because 1, the population's increasing and natural fertilizer can't do that. 2, that climate change is a minimal or marginal issue. And 3, that oil, that apparently it is because of oil, the lack of oil leads to food insecurity. First, on the idea that the population will increase, I tell you that oil will run out at a point in time, so we need a solution. We're not getting that on the government side. How are we getting that? By incentivizing the solution to come, by incentivizing us to seek a cheaper option, whether that be natural fertilizer, whether that be maybe even switching the system, going towards hydroponics or something of the sort. We see incentive only exist when prices are high. Second, on worldwide detriment, we tell you that the government is simply wrong. Most food insecurity in the world is actually caused by conflict, i.e., look at Israel in terms of Gaza. One second, brother. Look at Israel in terms of Gaza. We see that Israel is just blocking all the possible food that can enter. We see that humanitarian aid has been sent via boats even because of the actions taken by Israel. Accepted.
In terms of actually, it's too long.
Okay. C2 on inflation, they argue that inflation's up and that leads to a dictatorship. We tell you that the examples that they give that primarily lead their warranting are wrong, and we tell you that they don't give warranting as to how the rest of it happens, only relying on this example. They tell us it's because of oil. We tell you, again, it's not because of oil. We tell you that conflict occurs if, not Israel, Pakistan and India have had a long historic history. We know that Pakistan broke apart from India. We know that that is where the conflict lies. We see that the oil issues in terms of that actually stem from this historical conflict. So whatever they're on about, just drop the contention. C3 on transportation, they tell us that 90% of transportation uses oil, and for this reason, when we have high oil prices, we're not that bad. We argue renewable energy. They respond first, we need resources. Second, that when we rise prices, it's in that harm, i.e. UPS. I think a really important warrant that I would probably cross-apply in many places, judges, is that oil prices will never be stable. Why is this? Because too many people are trying to go for it. This is a net harm in our society. Why? Because we see that leads to major conflict, i.e. Iran and the U.S. currently, i.e. the United States versus Venezuela, i.e. most Middle Eastern conflicts, i.e. OPEC. We see that there's a long history of conflict. So what does that mean? This means that oil will always be dependent on whether or not the U.S. decides to be friendly, whether or not this big power decides to be friendly, which is especially now, a severely unstable thing to hope for. So, if this is the way that the world exists, no matter the motion, if this is the way that the world exists, we see that we want to then switch from oil prices, which we again are, and we want to again just switch from oil, which again we are only incentivizing on the opposition. On the point of a little bit more about electric transportation, we tell you that electric transportation has grown significantly, especially within the last few decades. We see that this has expanded to many other places, and that the stat that 90% of transportation uses oil is wrong, because most transportation, especially transportation, for example, in the US and Canada, and most of the transportation big states aren't using gas, they're using electric. We tell you second, though, that if these companies want demands, they can't rely on an unstable place, which is oil. If the companies wants to give their customers low prices so that they increase the amount of revenue that they're getting, you're not getting that by relying on oil, which has historically been unstable. We've seen this especially within the past few years. Biden, I say he was like a better president than Trump, and oil prices still rose significantly. No, oil prices still rose significantly during that time. We say instability is going to exist no matter what. We need solvency. Find that on op. Moving to op case on that note. C1 on green energy. We tell you we incentivize the switch to green energy. The argument in response is that we need to stable the price to transition. I tell you that there's no incentive if the price is stable because of the inherent simplicity behind oil. We say that only exists when the core issue with oil is demonstrated, and that only occurs on the opposition side of this debate. Again, C2 on behavioral changes, we tell you that people avoid oil when oil prices are high, and oil causes a really big net harm. In response, they say it hasn't done so, and that like people still use cars. We tell you a few things. One, that people probably use their cars less during this time, which is net harm. Two, that EV use has grown significantly within the past few years, and that's because of these unstable oil prices. And three, that people start seeing the issue as occurring within the world when we allow this to exist. So at minimum, we're building awareness, meaning more possibility for solvency on these long-term issues that lead to possible extinction. Lastly, on EVs, the responses that like batteries leak into the ocean. I tell you a few things. One, there's no warranty as to why these batteries have to be poured into the ocean. They don't. They can be stored in like man-made potholes where people just throw things in, similar to nuclear waste. Over time, vote
Quick off-time roadmap. I had some conceptualization for the round, and then I have the voting ballot the judges should consider and decide the winner. With that, I'll start my 4-minute speech in 3, 2, 1. Incentive. Incentive is how anything happens in this world. We are here debating right now because I have an incentive to learn from debates. I like education, and then also win the tournament. There's an incentive for this building to be created because education is important to the state, so they fund the schools. Incentive is all around us. So, when it comes to climate change, which we believe is one of the biggest impacts you could have, a death in the entirety of humanity and many other animals, if you were to do nothing and continue the status quo for only a couple more decades, as I said, per many studies, it was not responded to, so it does flow through. So, you need incentives to do things, because the government, again, as my partner said, keeps adding problems that we all agree to. A lot of problems that stem from oil all need solutions, but the gov can't give any. The op can. The op provides you with actual incentive that, while it may lead to some short-term harm, as the government did point out, what you do lead to is not extinction. So when you hear these, and I'll get through the flow, but when you hear arguments like, oh, people have to take longer to get to work, I would much rather take longer to get to work than die in 50 years, or have my kids die in 50 years. I think it's a pretty simple argument here. You need to have some sort of incentive, so judges, when you decide the round, climate change is the most urgent, and how you get to any sort of solvency matters most. Again, we're not proposing we're solving climate change in general. That is very difficult and creates a much larger task. But overall, we believe that on the motion of if rising oil prices is more harmful or beneficial, you see that it's much more beneficial on the point of climate change, which is the most weighed impact. So with that, I have 3 voting ballots you guys that I believe the judge should deeply consider when deciding the ballot. First one is slowing climate change. Second is transition to non-oil resources. And third is small nations. Let's go one by one. Firstly, on slowing climate change, we believe this is the most important one. It's our first contention about green energy. We say very explicitly that when you're in times of stability, the government says, well, just do it during the time of stability. You can switch renewable oil to the end. But whenever we do have times of stability in oil prices, we don't do it because, again, there's no incentive. We need to provide incentive for renewable energy to happen. Renewable energy will only become the main source of energy when you have an incentive, and here we give you one. Therefore, all of our warrants flow through on the first contention. They say it hasn't happened in the past. You would switch to coal. First of all, coal leads to many of the same problems. People don't want to do that. Coal is also a finite resource, unlike renewable energy. And the fact that people haven't gone to green energy in the past is because there hasn't been an incentive. This gives us one. Therefore, we cleanly win slowing climate change, which again would lead to the end of humanity if you don't buy this point. Secondly, on transition to non-oil resources, this is our second and third contention, talking about both behavioral change and then the EV point. You need to have a transition, right? And we still provide that for you. Government may try to come up here and structure our case as one of mass change instantly. There's no time to react. The rising oil prices isn't saying no oil. Oil also happened. What you instead see is behavioral change. People taking the month off of using their cars because it's so expensive to get gas, even if they don't want to. People using EVs, which outside of the climate change point is simply safer for them. Outside of all the other impact you get about, again, safer EVs transitioning to non-oil resources, you end up seeing that you end up when there is a time of crisis and you have to get rid of oil because either oil becomes gone because it's finite or because climate change becomes a real grave issue, you end up seeing that the opposition side is way more prepared in terms of transitioning to that. The government in the future is going to have a way harder time transitioning everybody off of oil because everybody's way too comfortable, everybody's way too unsafe, and overall you see a much higher benefit on the opposition side under this point. And lastly, small nations. They talk a lot about minorities matter more than rich people and it all matters. So here's the point on minorities. Simply put, the place where oil comes from is not a matter of where the richest countries are, it matters where it is. And we've told you several times, Guyana being a great example, that you can get a much higher increase of money because of the exports of oil, and they would like to help out their nations. The Guyana did it through the AU, many other countries do it as well. So on the points of small nations, transition to non-oil resources, and most importantly, climate change, we urge an opposition ballot. That's the end of my time. Thank you.
I'm going to be going over just the main points of clash, framework summarizing. Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Okay. My time begins. 3, 2, 1. Let's take the negation at their highest ground. Assume climate change is like the most important issue in the round, and we'll show you why we still win here, even assuming oil is not inevitable. The first reason is that we actually turn incentive. The warrant of Norway goes conceded throughout this round, which we extend and repeatedly tell you that this is the one country that was relying on oil, that was only able to transition when prices were going down and when prices were stable because their economy was stable enough and supporting the people for them to allow inroads to solving climate change. Again, the incentive, as they tell you, is climate change because it's an issue. If the incentive is that we want to stop everybody from burning into a big fiery ball, that incentive only gets prioritized and realized when people actually have a stable economy so they can look at this issue. We already told you empirically that we see no worldwide solvency because of like oil shock incentives towards climate change. It hasn't changed. The status quo, we've had tons of oil shocks. We're still, as they tell you, we're still on this tipping point of climate change. So clearly oil shocks aren't creating all the solvency that they try to tell you. But second, let's go to the framework on why oil prices also basically take out everything they say. The only thing they say is that oil is limited, but we're contextualizing to the status quo. If climate change is such a pressing issue, my partner literally tells you how the capitalist nature of our society makes it because oil is always cheaper, people always go to that. The only response they have is why don't people go to coal? We tell you the response to this is that coal actually has like tangible air quality retractions where people end up dying from that, and that people end up dying like from coal. That's why people prefer oil, because oil is still much cheaper than everything else and at a similar price to coal, but yet it's the only alternative that people prefer. Also extend infrastructure and how it's like all countries need to have oil-based infrastructure and extend venture obligation. All these are warrants for why oil is inevitable in the status quo. Will be the ones that are used right now and will be basically take us past this tipping point regardless of whether or not oil prices go up or down. So you're basically looking at, first of all, we're the only side that can solve for climate change, but second of all, if you assume climate change is inevitable, we want to of course minimize the harms that happen in the world that we see right now, and that's where we turn effectively to the affirmative case. On the first contention of fertilizer, the only response the negation gives you throughout this whole round is that we survived for a bunch of years. But we tell you, first of all, my partner explicitly says that population growth requires feeding more people, which means industrial agriculture, which means that you need fertilizer to actually do this efficiently enough to feed this amount of people. And so this means that you need industrial agriculture supported by fertilizer that requires oil to make sure that 2.3 billion people that are at extreme risk of starvation don't just immediately starve when you have rising high prices. They try to tell you on our warrant of starvation in the status quo that Gaza is being blocked. They ignore the other half, which is actually the majority of the people, which is Sudan. Sudan is completely dropped, extended throughout this round, that like there's like 30 million people there in Sudan alone that are suffering from severe food aid that are probably going to starve because of the current crisis. This is like literally just something that they don't touch. They only talk about Israel and Gaza. They don't extend the major part of this war where we tell you that it does lead to starvation tangibly, and you will see like worldwide starvation when you have rising oil prices. This is simply empirically proven. Extend this through. Okay, let's go just a couple other issues here. We think political shock is not responded to very well. They just said like whatever. My partner tells you that the prime ministers and the dictator literally said this is like the control is necessary as a dictatorship because of oil prices. Like this is a fact. This is not something up for debate. This is like literally something that someone said, and you can't just go back in time and change what he said with a time machine. Okay, and on transportation, people just say that they won't use UPS because it's not beneficial by the system, but we already both agree that capitalism is the entrenched system, and clearly UPS is entrenched in the system. People aren't just diverting from UPS, they don't have an alternative. Prices go up for them, so things are more expensive for everybody. And they also, the second other response they give you is that like, you have to depend on big cars being friendly. Unfortunately, we're not imagining a utopia. We're talking about the world today in which you are dependent on big powers or whatever being friendly, which means that the only way out is to actually maintain quality of life for your people through oil. That is super important. I wish we could construct like a hypothetical world in which this wasn't the case, but unfortunately, in the world that we live in, rising oil prices do more harm than good than stable or decreasing oil prices fundamentally. Let's also go to some weighing here. We think you probably weigh probability over everything because we think we have infinite policy stages. If you're always going towards the largest magnitude impact that has like a 0.001% chance of solvency, which means you never solve for any harms or any, which means everybody dies before climate change even becomes like a realized impact. So we think that you're probably looking to solve for our guaranteed probability because our warrants are conceded, which means that you're looking to prioritize the warrants that we give you. Well, let's also do some impact calculus here. Let's see, we have 2.3 billion people starving. They even need a 25% chance, even a 25% chance of them solving would be less than 2.3 billion people dying. And so we see that like they literally have no solvency, and even if they have 24%, we still outweigh on everything. We think you vote Gov across the ballot to help starving people and even turn climate change, but you're looking to probability and you're looking to maintain people's quality to life and their life itself. Thank you.
Hey, rounds.
Who wants to step out?
I don't care one way or another.
Yeah, me neither. Whatever you guys would prefer.
Step out.
I have no idea where my water bottle is. So tired. Here, if I go backwards, all of this.
Oh,